measures are pretty persuasive. This isn't a case of economists being right and Americans being wrong. Americans are taking cues from their own lives, and what they're seeing are financial obstacles that feel pretty insurmountable. And that translates into feeling down about the economy, right? But I guess the question in my mind now is, what will it take for people to feel good about the economy?
Right. So I think that we are seeing some attempts at policy responses that could help around the edges here. Student loans are a good example. We know that people feel bad about the fact that they have to pay back those student loans. But the Biden administration has taken efforts to either make fewer people have to pay back their student loans or make sure that those payback plans and schedules are less onerous than they previously were. So there's some things around the edges that you can do like that. I think there are some things that you can't do that you hear from people they would like to see, but that don't actually work in economic terms. A big one is what economists call deflation, which is a fancy way to say actually bringing price levels down.
And how would that work?
Yeah, so when you talk to households, they'll often say, well, I really wish that the prices of the things I buy every day would just fall, and that's what I'm waiting for. And the reason that can't happen, the reason you don't want deflation in an economy, as counterintuitive as that feels, is if prices fall across the economy, then you and I are going to stop spending our money. We're going to wait. We're not going to buy that t-shirt that we want or that latte that we want. We're going to wait till next week when it's cheaper. And if everybody across the whole economy is doing that simultaneously, it's going to grind the economy to a standstill. We're all going to get fired because nobody's going to be buying the things that we produce at our jobs. And then everything's a disaster. So you don't want deflation. Deflation is terrible for the economy.
So then is this sourness about the economy permanent? Is this the new normal? Because your numbers seem to be, these big ticket items that are really at the center of people's lives. They seem more like really enduring features of the economy than temporary blips.
I really think it's an open question. So these are 3 trends that we decided to look at because they seem like part of the conversation, but it could be that these aren't even the right ones, that something else is the thing that is pulling confidence down. And whatever it is could worsen or dissipate. It's just a very uncertain moment. I think that part of what is going to be important here is waiting to see if this sort of resolves over time. One thing that we can definitively say is that we've already got some glimmers of hope. Since the sort of peak of the inflation in summer 2022, consumer confidence has picked up a little bit. It has gotten better than it was at its very worst. And so it could be the case that people just need time to get used to higher price levels, to realize that inflation is fading, to sort of get used to sort of a new normal with slightly higher prices, and that consumer confidence will sort of readjust as that happens.
So basically to wait for people to adjust to this new normal.
Exactly. It could just take a while.
Gina, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.
With no fees or minimums, banking with Capital One is the easiest decision in the history of decisions. Even easier than deciding to listen to another episode of your favorite podcast. And with no overdraft fees, is it even a decision? That's banking reimagined. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. See CapitalOne.com/bank. Capital One NA. Member FDIC.
Here's what else you should know today. Federal prosecutors in Manhattan charged an Indian national with plotting to kill a U.S. citizen who is a Sikh separatist. Prosecutors say that the scheme was devised by an agent of the Indian government, an allegation that could complicate the delicate relations between the United States and India. The charges in New York came after Canada accused the Indian government of being involved in the killing of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil in June. And Henry Kissinger, one of the most consequential statesmen in American history, who advised 12 presidents, died on Wednesday at the age of 100. Kissinger, who was from a German Jewish refugee family, was the most powerful U.S. Secretary of State in the post-war era. He engineered America's opening to China, negotiated its exit from the Vietnam War, and remade America's relationship with the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. He was hailed as an ultra-realist who reshaped diplomacy to better serve American interests. But he was also reviled at having abandoned American values, particularly in the area of human rights, if he thought it served the nation's purposes. Today's episode was produced by Shannon Lane, Mary Wilson, Asta Chaturvedi, and Eric Krupke, with help from Luke Vanderploeg. It was edited by MJ Davis-Lynn, with help from Lisa Chow and Lexi Diao. Contains original music by Marian Lozano and Dan Powell, and was engineered by Alyssa Moxley. Our theme music is by Jim Brunberg and Ben Landsberg of Wonderly. Special thanks to Lydia DePillis. That's it for the Daily. I'm Sabrina Tavernise. See you tomorrow.
This podcast is supported by Doctors Without Borders. When people are in crisis, there's no time to lose. Every day, Doctors Without Borders teams are saving lives around the world, providing emergency medical care and supplies to people caught in the crossfire of war and conflict, treating injured patients in the aftermath of earthquakes and floods, and responding to disease outbreaks and rising malnutrition. This Giving Week, help Doctors Without Borders continue delivering life-saving care wherever it's needed most. Donate today at doctorswithoutborders.org/thedaily.
Loneliness is as bad for us as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Finding connection in lonely times. Does this matter more than we ever realized? Ultimately, social connection really needs to be our bottom line in terms of public health. I'm Nyla Boodoo from Axios. This is One Big Thing. A few weeks ago on the podcast, I talked with Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy about how social media is contributing to the declining mental health of young people across the U.S. Thanks to many of you who reached out to us about grappling with this as parents. That got us thinking about an overlapping crisis that affects a huge swath of us, regardless of age, and one that's also been front and center for public health experts, especially in the last few years. That's loneliness. Nearly 40% of Americans rated their mental health as only fair or poor toward the end of last year. That's according to the American Psychiatric Association. And according to the Surgeon General, about 1 in 2 American adults report experiencing loneliness. Not surprisingly, one result of all of this is even more self-help voices emerging from every corner of the internet, from TikTok to Instagram to podcasts and beyond, talking about staving off loneliness and finding happiness. Well, one of those voices is rooted in science and has been around for years. Dr. Laurie Santos is a professor of psychology at Yale University and host of the Happiness Lab podcast. We're pretty bad at predicting what makes us feel good. A lot of us are putting a lot of work into feeling better and feeling happier, but we're going about it the wrong way because we don't know the stuff to go for. Dr. Santos became known for her now extraordinarily famous course at Yale, Psychology in the Good Life, which put her front and center of conversations around cultivating happiness in our modern world and connecting to combat loneliness and isolation. And people are clearly seeking out that help. Her podcast, The Happiness Lab, has been downloaded more than 90 million times since it launched in 2019. I asked her to sit down with me to talk about how we can do this better and how to foster connection in this moment. Hi, Laurie. Welcome to One Big Thing.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on the show.
Laurie, let's start with loneliness. When we're talking about this, what do we mean? Is it about a lack of interaction with other people? I think you can think of loneliness in 3 different ways, and a lot of scholars think of it like this. So there's this kind of interpersonal loneliness, which is kind of like, I don't really have a best friend, right? I don't really have somebody that I can talk to about big issues, right? I think there's also a kind of what you might call relational loneliness, right? Which is that I don't have like a crew of people that I just like go hang out with. I don't like do things socially. I don't engage in dinner parties, these kinds of things. But then there's also a sense of real community loneliness, where there's not kind of bigger groups that are doing meaningful things together. You know, think of civic organizations like the Lions Club, you know, engaging in church organizations, things like that. You know, there's just lots of evidence that those kinds of community connections are going down. And so I think when we're thinking about loneliness, we often mean it at those 3 different levels. And I think the remedy is that we need to be solving loneliness on all 3 of those levels. All of them affect our psychology, and all of them honestly affect, I think, our politics and our civic engagement.
How much of that connection or that support needs to be in person versus virtual?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think by and large the research really suggests that what seems to matter the most is that we're connecting in real time. You know, you and I are having this conversation right now over Zoom, and so we're not in the same room. We can't like hug one another or really see one another closely. But because we're connecting in real time, it kind of feels like we're having an ongoing conversation, right? I can read your emotions in real time. I think the problem is that a lot of our online connection isn't in real time. It's that I text you and like 5 minutes later you text me back, or I'm scrolling through a social media feed that you posted something on weeks ago that you might not even be paying attention to. And so I think, you know, while of course in real life connection is best if you can get it, that's what we're evolved for primates, it seems like the real nutritional value comes from the in real time. And so there's lots of technological ways we can do that, which is awesome. It means that you can connect with your ride or die bestie, you know, even if they're living across the country. It means that you can form smaller community groups, book clubs and things like that on Zoom, and they work, you know, kind of just as good as in person.
When we look at headlines that say, like, last year we had the highest number ever of Americans who took their own lives, or when we look at numbers of opioid overdose deaths, are we making the right connections between loneliness and its role that it can play in mental health?
Well, I think that role is becoming clearer and clearer. I think experts are realizing that when you look at things like deaths of despair, yeah, there might be addiction issues and substance issues, often poverty issues and structural issues, but on top of that, you often have the psychological issue of loneliness. Loneliness is one of the things that causes people to potentially engage in addictive tendencies, right? Just because you're kind of not feeling good. Loneliness feels really quite terrible, right? Loneliness, I think, also is just a really terrible health stressor. It's actually worse as a public health problem than the obesity crisis, because loneliness actually affects things like our immune function, our level of heart disease, our ability to recover if we have a terminal illness or something terrible like cancer. And so I think it's really important to start thinking of loneliness not as this kind of, oh, it's a sort of problem, it'd be nice to solve it and improve social connection. Ultimately, social connection really needs to be our bottom line in terms of public health. I think we need to solve for that first, and interestingly, a lot of the other problems we're talking about, deaths of despair and so on, I think those things will get better as a result of focusing on connection.
Can you explain a little bit more about how connection also doesn't just fight loneliness, but also fosters joy, and how important that is for our well-being?
Yeah, I think this is something that we often forget, which is that just like having a random conversation with somebody makes us happy. One of my favorite experiments on this comes from the University of Chicago psychologist Nick Epley, where he did this study where he just asked people on trains to just chat with a stranger. And he had people predict, how would this make you feel? And people predicted that this was not just going to be neutral for their joy, they predicted it was going to feel awkward and terrible, it was going to feel yucky. But when people actually engaged in those conversations, they wound up increasing their positive emotion in ways they didn't expect. And this was true for introverts and for extroverts. So I think this tells us 2 things. One is that just chatting with people, just feeling like you're connected, makes us feel more joyful. It increases our positive emotion. It feels good. But the second thing his study tells us is that we don't realize that. You know, we're often in a position where we're kind of feeling crappy. You know, I've watched, you know, the latest terrible news about what's taking place in the Middle East or what's going on with climate change, and I feel yucky, and I'm motivated to do something that will make me feel better. But often I think that's like plopping down to watch TV or like eating something delicious, or like what I could just do is reach out to a friend and that will make me feel better.
The next time you're tempted to, treat yourself to a cupcake or a latte, treat someone else to the same kind of thing and enjoy the benefit of that. Even something as simple as complimenting a stranger can be the kind of thing that gives us a well-needed boost in well-being. And so I think we often forget the power of social connection for making us feel good and making other people feel good too. This is a bias that researchers like Nick Epley call under-sociality. We're kind of mistaken in our beliefs of how good social connection feels, and that means we don't really engage in it nearly as much as we should to feel better.
In fact, in that same study, I feel like I remember talking to Nick about this when I was first starting out in Chicago. Even smiling at people makes you feel better, right? You don't even have to talk to them. You could just smile at strangers on the train.
Exactly. I mean, I was walking over here for this podcast interview, and lots of schools were getting out on my street, and I just happened to make eye contact with this high school student that was coming out, and she smiled and I smiled, and now it's just, again, a little tiny moment of positive joy. I think another thing is that we have a mistaken idea about how happiness works. We think it has to be this big thing that, we get some enormous, promotion at work or some enormous vacation, but really the better metaphor is for happiness is it's kind of like a leaky tire, and you need to sort of fill it up with these tiny moments, and those tiny social moments mean a lot for our positive emotion.
More with Yale's Dr. Laurie Santos coming up in a moment.
COP28 is live in Dubai, and Axios will be on the ground from December 4th through the 6th, hosting a series of essential events at the Axios House. If you're attending COP28, join us for 3 days of newsworthy programming, networking, bites, and beverages for the opportunity to hear from and engage with today's most important business and sustainability leaders. We'll have interviews with former U.S. Vice President Al Gore, the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Energy, David Turk, and more. If you want to join us, please visit axios.com/events for more information.
Welcome back to One Big Thing from Axios. I'm Nyla Boodoo. I've been talking with Dr. Laurie Santos, professor of psychology at Yale University and host of the Happiness Lab podcast, about how critical social connection is to our health as individuals and as a society. Laurie, I was hoping to get kind of a reality check on what we've been talking about here. There's a whole industry now of podcasts and self-help books and things that claim to help us find happiness. And I think some people might be really skeptical about what you're saying, right? But you're not an influencer, you are a scientist. So I wonder if you can give us some more examples of how cognitive science and psychological insights are actually applicable here. Like you mentioned Nick Epley's research. Are there other specific examples that explain why the social connection really works?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest insight that I think we're getting about happiness, kind of empirically, like in terms of the research, is that we're pretty bad at predicting what makes us feel good, right? We assume it's much more money or more accolades or changing our...
The rebates come from a half-cent sales tax voters approved in 1996 to build the stadiums. Officials at the time promised to use 30% of the revenue for tax rebates, but that hasn't happened consistently since 2011. Commission President Alicia Reese couldn't get support for a full rebate this year.
The homeowners, once again, have gotten screwed. They got screwed when this thing got passed. They're getting screwed every day. We don't do the 30%.
If the money ever runs out, the county would have to pay for maintaining and upgrading the stadiums using the general fund. Reese ultimately joined the other two commissioners in supporting a rebate using 12.5% of revenue. Homeowners will see their 2024 property tax bill reduced about $43 per $100,000 of home value. The state of Indiana's lawsuit against TikTok has been dismissed almost a year after the case was filed in Allen County Superior Court by Attorney General Todd Rokita. Judge Jennifer DeGroot ruled the court does not have any jurisdiction over the China-based company. A mysterious and potentially deadly canine respiratory illness has sickened dogs in more than a dozen states. While the illness has not been detected in Ohio yet, veterinary health experts are monitoring the spread closely. Dr. Jeanette O'Quinn is an associate professor for the Ohio State University College of Veterinary Medicine.
Just like when people get together and gather, when dogs get together and gather, say at boarding kennels, or they're traveling around and visiting with other dogs from other areas, we're certainly expecting to see more upper respiratory infections. People often refer to this as kennel cough. We call it canine infectious respiratory disease complex.
O'Quinn advises pet owners look for any signs of illness in your dog. Make sure you contact your veterinarian so the dog can be evaluated, tested, and treated if necessary. Rain moves in later tonight, a low of 40. Cloudy and 53 tomorrow. It's 55 degrees now.
This is All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Mary Louise Kelly.
And I'm Juana Summers. New York Republican Congressman George Santos is still insisting that he will not resign, even though another vote on whether to expel him from the U.S. House of Representatives is expected tomorrow. Earlier this month, the House Ethics Committee found that Santos, quote, blatantly stole from his campaign. Speaking on the House floor earlier today, Santos pushed back on those claims.
I will not stand by quietly. They want me out of this body. The people of the 3rd District of New York sent me here. If they want me out, they're going to have to go silence those people and take the hard vote.
Well, NPR's Jasmine Garst is in Long Island. She is in George Santos' district, and she joins us now. Hi there.
Hello.
All right, Jasmine, what is it like there? What have you been hearing as you've been talking to folks?
Well, I spoke to people from across the political spectrum, and you would be hard-pressed to find anyone here who isn't disgusted with Santos's alleged behavior. Earlier this morning, I spoke to Martins Alves. She was waiting for the train with her 2 kids, and she said if he does not get voted out, she will feel
really mad, really aggravated, the whole thing. That just shows us that politics are more important than our values.
So while Santos seems to think a vote to expel him would be silencing people in his district, there are certainly people here who do not feel that way at all.
Right, and we should just note, there is of course the chance that Santos hangs on to that seat. Are there concerns that that would have larger scale political repercussions?
Well, the sense I got was people being fed up with a system that enabled Santos to rise, that he's symptomatic of a larger problem. A lot of people wouldn't talk to me on record, but said something along the lines of, well, you know, this is how low American politics has stooped. One woman who did speak to me was Rena Medea. She was going on a stroll with her mom, and she told me she feels what happens to Santos in the coming days could send a message to other politicians about what kind of behavior they can and cannot get away with.
I understand the Republicans' point of view that they don't want to get rid of him because he is one of the few that they have in power in New York State, a very democratic state. But we have to do something about this guy because he's being represented as an example, and you don't want that.
She says she feels this type of impunity is comparable to any corrupt governments abroad.
And she points out something that's a big concern for Republicans here in Washington, which is that if Santos is expelled, that will cut into their already slim House majority. What did Republicans there in New York have to say about that?
Well, that's definitely a concern. New York votes Democratic, and there's no guarantee that another Republican will win the congressional seat Santos holds, especially after a scandal like this. Santos, for his part, has said he's not going to run for re-election. But Republican constituents I spoke to are also outraged with Santos's behavior. They feel it's just not something the party should stand by. This morning, I spoke to Lou Hochstein outside a coffee shop. He told me he voted for President Donald Trump, but he just has no more patience left for Santos.
I mean, he did things that he used our money to get Botox, and he used our money to go on and buy fancy. You see, when he dresses, everything is so spiffy and, you know, very nice. So I think he had enough chances. I would just toss him out with the garbage and get somebody fresh and new.
Santos says he didn't do anything wrong. People in this district are not buying it.
NPR's Jasmine Garst, thank you.
Thank you.
The U.S. is aging fast. In fact, the oldest baby boomers start turning 80 in a few years, and it is happening amid a historic shortage of affordable housing and high prices. NPR's Jennifer Ludden reports on a new warning that many seniors will struggle to get the housing and the care they need.
A few decades ago, Leslie McIntyre thought she was doing everything right for a comfortable life. She was a tax accountant in Washington, D.C., and co-owned a not-for-profit bookstore.
I had good savings. I was quite happy, quite frankly. And I was preparing to go back to school.
Then a car accident dislocated her hip, left her traumatized, and derailed her career. She held on in her rent-controlled apartment for quite a while, but eventually McIntyre went on disability and burned through savings, waiting 3 years to get into the senior housing where she is now.
And by the time I got in here, I was seriously considering going into a shelter. I paid my rent, my utilities. I had SNAP benefits for food, and I had $25 left over. And you just can't live on that in the long run.
McIntyre is now 69 and grateful to pay only 30% of her income for rent. Unlike Medicaid and SNAP benefits for food, federal housing subsidies are not an entitlement program. Only about a third of seniors who qualify actually get them. That's left more than 11 million older adults burdened by housing costs, an all-time high, according to a report out today from Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies. Lead author Jennifer Malinsky says that number will keep going up as boomers enter their 80s.
Their purchasing power is going down at a time when rents are rising and other costs are rising, food and healthcare and all of that.
More people will have medical problems, which can be costly, but their income is likely fixed or going down. The report finds only 14% of older adults living alone could afford a daily visit from a home health aide. Only 13% could move to assisted living without dipping into their assets. Two other trends spell trouble ahead. Since the 2008 housing crash, the home ownership rate for people in midlife is down significantly, and that could leave many of them cash-strapped later on because they have to rent. At the same time, there's been a jump in the share of older people who still owe money on their mortgage, even into their 80s.
People who have mortgages are so much more likely to face affordability challenges.
Malinsky says there just aren't nearly enough places that are safe, convenient, and affordable for people to live as they age.
You not only need affordable housing, you may also need accessible housing, and you may need to have it located near transportation because you no longer drive, or near your existing social and service network, which is really important.
The Harvard report also notes that people 50 and older now make up a growing share of the homeless population. That includes Harry Robertson, a Washington, D.C. native who spent years bouncing between shelters, rehab, friends, and family, never wanting to impose for too long.
I could never stay nowhere more than one day. If they allowed me 2 days, that was a blessing. So, I spent a lot of time outside.
Robertson is 56 and proud that he finally became sober while caring for his mother before she died. This year, he also got a federal housing voucher, but that process took 5 long years.
My little state then was not good at all. I was crumbling. It shouldn't take that long to get someone housing.
Margot Cushell of UC San Francisco says more people over 50 are also losing housing for the first time. Often it's those who've had low-wage, physically demanding jobs without a pension or strong health care.
Increasingly, the story of homelessness among adults is going to be older adults living in poverty who are spending what should be their retirement years in the streets.
So what to do about all of this? Harvard researcher Malinsky wants zoning changes to build more senior-friendly apartments, and more help for older people to retrofit their own homes to age in place safely. Leslie McIntyre, the woman who worried she'd end up in a shelter, has her own advice.
The main thing people need to know is that they need to be prepared beforehand for what's coming down the road.
Because you never know, she says, when bad things might happen. Jennifer Levin, NPR News, Washington.
Shane MacGowan, the frontman for the punk band The Pogues, has died. His wife, Victoria Mary Clark, announced the news this morning. He was 65 years old. MacGowan sang songs that mixed together hope and despair. NPR's Andrew Limbaum has more.
You know how some of the best Christmas songs are also some of the saddest songs you've ever heard? The Pogues' Fairy Tale of New York fits firmly within that tradition.
It was Christmas Eve. And the drum sang.
It's about this couple on
with Eglin.
Left executive session at 1:28.
But when Jackie attended one of the meetings, she said she got a rude awakening.
They did not acknowledge any of us. There was not an opportunity to speak. They closed the meeting and moved it to an executive session outside of that room on a different floor.
It never occurred to me that I wouldn't be allowed into the meeting.
Dennis Kushon, Executive Director of Harm Reduction Ohio, which works to help reduce overdose deaths, says he also was kept out of the meeting and was outraged.
tall white men. The last ride of Bonnie and Clyde, 1969, When We Were Young, Edgar Allan Poe, the Salem Witch Trial.
January will be our 10th year. Exciting. To do some kind of celebrating. We definitely have to do some kind of celebrating. 10 years in business, it's a small business. It's no joke. Yeah.
No joke at all. Ellen Kelly and Daniel McCarthy, co-owners of Champagne and Ink, making stationery up in Newport, Rhode Island. We do need your help to tell stories about this economy. Let us know how things are going, would you? Marketplace.org/myeconomy. This final note on the way out today, saw it in the Wall Street Journal. Data courtesy Spotify, which is out with its annual summaries of user habits the past 12 months. One last Taylor Swift item for the year. How about that? You know how Spotify tracks how much, as in how many minutes of a certain album or artist you've listened to? Well, to be in the top 1% of Swifties, the heaviest listeners to her, you have to have listened to at least 6,000 minutes of her. That is obviously 100 hours. The maximum data point on the scale, the heaviest use, 346,705 minutes. I cannot do that math. You've got to just figure it's somebody who left it playing, right?
Marketplace is supported by Wealth Enhancement Group, dedicated to the art of financial planning backed by the science of investing. WealthEnhancement.com. And by Financially Inclined. A podcast from Marketplace is all about money lessons for living life your own way. Listen to the new season wherever you get your podcasts.
All right, we got to go. No time for a moment of economic context today. I went through well, everything on the show today. That's my fault. John Buckley, John Gordon, Rick Carter, Anthony Parker, Amanda Peacher, and Stephanie Seek are the Marketplace editing staff. Mir Babawe is the managing editor. I'm Kai Risdal. We will see you tomorrow, everybody. This is APM.
And this is 91.7 WBXU. I'm Mike Edmiston. Mostly cloudy overnight, rain moving in with a low 40, and tomorrow rain, especially in the morning, high 54. It's 55 now.
Support comes from the University of Cincinnati and the Lindner College of Business, offering their online Masters of Finance degree, 100% online, from the same nationally recognized faculty as the on-campus programs. Financial aid available, and the program comes with a dedicated student support specialist and academic advisor. More at online.uc.edu.
Hey, it's Steve Inskeep.
And I'm Aisha Roscoe.
That extra car that you're not really using?
That car could be worth hundreds of dollars in support or more as a donation.
Think about it.
To donate your car, go to WBXU.org under Ways to Give.
91.7 WVXU Cincinnati and 88.5 WMUP Oxford. News from Cincinnati Public Radio and NPR.
I talked to some media experts, and they basically say that we just don't have the data. But it's possible that the environment, the conversation that's happening on social media, not only reflects how people feel, but could actually potentially help to drive the economy.
I'm Sabrina Tavernese. That's coming up on The Daily from the New York Times.
The Daily is supported by C3 Generative AI. Verified, traceable answers. Secure, hallucination-free. LLM agnostic. IP liability-free. Learn more at C3.ai. And by American Public Media. Forever Ago is a history show for the whole family. The podcast makes learning about the past fun while teaching listeners to think critically about history.
This is Asian View from NHK World Japan. I'm Rajapada. Japan has asked the United States not to fly its Osprey military aircraft except for search and rescue operations until they're deemed safe. The move comes after a CV-22 Osprey crashed into waters off southwestern Japan Wednesday afternoon. 8 people were on board. 1 crew member is confirmed dead. An eyewitness has this to say.
It was like the so-called inverted flight. After it turned over, a fire broke out from the propeller on the left wing. There was an explosion right after that. Then the aircraft went straight down without gliding.
Japan's Coast Guard says a life raft was found, but no survivors were on board. The U.S. Air Force Special Operations Command says the Osprey belongs to the U.S. Yokoda Air Base in Tokyo. The base was conducting regular drills off Yakushima Island. CV-22s have been involved in a number of serious accidents. The Philippine government and the country's communist rebels have agreed to resume peace negotiations after a 6-year hiatus. It comes as China increases pressure on the Philippines over the disputed South China Sea. Government Peace Process Advisor Carlito Galvez Jr. has this to say.
Socioeconomic and environmental issues and the foreign security threats facing the country, the parties recognize the need to unite as a nation in order to urgently address these challenges.
Fighting between the government and the New People's Army dates back to the 1960s. The conflict has reportedly killed more than 40,000 people. This is NHK World Japan. North Korean soldiers in the joint security area of the demilitarized zone that separates North and South Korea have resumed carrying handguns. The JSA has been disarmed under a 2018 agreement aimed at reducing inter-Korean military tension. Sources close to the South Korean military say North Korean soldiers stationed in the area in Panmunjom resumed carrying pistols late last week. South Korea's Yonhap news agency said the South could rearm itself in the JSA if the current situation continues. A major motor show has opened in Thailand, where Chinese automakers are hoping their electric vehicles will compete against Japan's market dominance. 40 manufacturers are showcasing their models at the Thailand International Motor Expo. Major Chinese carmaker Changang Automobile unveiled its new electric SUV and sedan. The company also revealed its plans to start EV production in Thailand in 2025 and roll out more electric models. Leading Chinese EV maker BYD and Guangzhou Automobile Group's EV brand Ion also have plans for local production. The Thai government subsidizes purchases of EVs made in the country. About 58,000 electric vehicles were newly registered in Thailand in the first 10 months of this year. That's a more than 8-fold increase from the same period last year. Japanese automakers currently have an 80% share of the overall Thai auto market. Japan and other countries working to restructure Sri Lanka's external debts have reached a basic agreement with the South Asian country. Japan's Vice Minister of Finance for International Affairs, Kanda Masato, told reporters the deal will include extending deadlines and lowering interest rates. Sri Lanka has suspended external debt repayments since April last year. Fiscal policy failures triggered a sharp depreciation of the country's currency and a rise in prices. The country's biggest creditor is China, but it took part in the framework only as an observer. Beijing earlier announced it had agreed with the Sri Lankan government on conditions for debt restructuring separately from the framework. Christmas has arrived early at a popular diving spot in western Japan. Divers wearing Santa Claus costumes set up a Christmas tree underwater in the town of Kushimoto, Wakayama Prefecture. They use sandbags and ropes to secure the decorated 3-meter-tall tree to the seabed, 18 meters below surface. Michi Hiroyuki of an association of diving service operators says he hopes divers will enjoy the Christmas tree. The association installs one every year to help reinvigorate the local community. This is Asian View from NHK World Japan.
What if, by hard work, force of will, determination, and love, you've carved out a sliver, a tiny plot to sell your wares that everybody wants, and now they're coming for you. When it's Snap Judgment, the hot dog king of New York. Snap Judgment. Do not miss it.
Sunday evenings at 6 and Thursday nights at 10 on 91.7 WBXU.
From the New York Times, I'm Sabrina Tavernisi, and this is The Daily. The American economy, by many measures, is doing better than it's done in years. But for many Americans, that's not how it feels.
I mean, I get comments from people all the time that I could stretch a dollar like no one else, and even now I'm struggling to do it.
You know, when I'm talking about inflation, I'm mostly talking about the cost of groceries.
Milk used to be like $1.89 a gallon. It's now $2.89. I'm like, thank God I'm lactose intolerant.
Their feeling is pointing to an enduring economic mystery. Why do Americans feel so bad when the economy is so good?
We're kind of just struggling in what's left of the middle class.
Today, my colleague Gina Smiling on a new way to understand the disconnect. It's Thursday, November 30th. So Gina, we're going to talk today about the economy and how, despite the fact that it's doing quite well, Americans are feeling pretty badly about it. So, you know, this is a puzzle we spent some time on the show already thinking about. 2 years ago, we did a show with our colleague Ben Castleman. At the time, the economy was still really emerging from the pandemic. Inflation was really high. And the thinking at the time was, you know, this is a temporary thing. Americans feel badly about the economy, but it will pass. 2 years later, here we are. The economy is actually doing better, but people feel bad still. So help us understand what's going on here.
Right. So, like you said, this is a pretty confusing situation. Overall, we're actually seeing some pretty decent-looking economic indicators, at least by the economic indicators we sort of traditionally look at. You know, we're in a situation where inflation has come down quite a bit. You know, we saw it peak at above 9% in the sort of summer of 2022, but now we're down at like 3%, a little bit above 3%. We've seen unemployment come down pretty sharply up to historically pretty low level. Wage growth has been pretty solid recently. It's actually beating inflation a little bit in recent months. And yet, despite all of this, people still seem to be feeling really bad.
So how bad exactly are people feeling? Like, what's the damage in terms of the sentiment here?
So one good way to get a sense of that is to look at the University of Michigan consumer confidence numbers. These are sort of the baseline of how people are feeling about the economy. And they give that number as an index. In February 2020, so headed into the pandemic, we had a pretty good economy, and the index level was at 101. During the worst part of the pandemic, that level dropped to the low 70s. It's now actually at 63.8, so down even from the sort of worst part of the pandemic.
That is pretty remarkable and also very perplexing. So let's start to unpack this, Gina. What is going on here?
So I think that what is pretty clear is that the traditional measures we look at to try and gauge the economy and how we think people should be feeling about the economy are not really telling us the full story here. And so it's sort of incumbent upon us as reporters to sort of look for other explanations and try to understand why people feel so bad at a time when the data look good and consumers are still spending. So we did a couple of things. We talked to a lot of people. We looked at a lot of polls, and we basically came up with 3 numbers that we think explain what might be going on here.
So what are they? Give me the first one.
So I think one number that helps to explain this disconnect is 20%. And that's how much consumer prices overall are up since late 2019.
So this is inflation.
Exactly, inflation, but sort of a 4-year aggregate inflation, which is not traditionally the way we think about that number, but I think is useful for thinking about this moment in inflation.
And can you translate that for me, Gina? The 4-year aggregate number?
Yeah, so it means that over the last 4 years, the total consumer shopping basket, everything we buy, is up by about 20%. The reason that matters is because it's a much quicker pace of acceleration than we're used to. It means that people still remember a time when prices were about a fifth lower, and yet they are facing these considerably higher prices today. And so I think of it as sticker shock inflation. even though day-to-day price increases have really slowed down recently, even though inflation numbers are looking a lot better, people are still experiencing these much higher price levels because we've had so much inflation since the pandemic. And so I think that is explaining part of our disconnect here.
So Gina, let's just take an example of something where people are having that sticker shock.
So I think a good one to use, because it's something that's really salient for consumers, is gas. If you were buying a 15-gallon tank of gas at the start of 2020, it would have run you something in the range of $38. Now, if you're buying the same 15-gallon tank of gas, it would run you about $49.
Oh, wow.
And so that's a pretty dramatic increase, and people really feel that. Gas doesn't have a lot to do with any government policy. It's because of a bunch of global forces that those prices move, but that doesn't mean people don't respond to it. It's something that people see in their everyday lives.
Right.
Another thing that people pay a lot of attention to is the price of food. And if you look at food at home, which is basically groceries, those prices are up nearly 26% compared to late 2019.
26%?
Yeah, 26%. So if you're driving, if you're paying for food, if you're trying to buy these sort of very basics of life, they're a lot more expensive.
So bottom line, prices are still too damn high, right? And it's a shock when you go into the gas station or the grocery store. So what is your next